Whenever you're ready.
All right. How school sports can affect a student's growth. Overall, school sports have a huge influence upon students while they're being educated. A report in 2013 states that about 3.3 million students say were in a high school sport, and as reported by Hilary Levy Friedman, they would generate a huge part of their life, with another graph stating that about 34% of girls and about 61% of boys played a high school sport, things that, as stated, were a huge part of their life. So, from this, there seems to be many pros to it, but there's also a lot of cons. So the main question is there a limit into how much school sports should be in a student's life and how much they should be invested into it, regards into their well-being throughout their schooling career? Now, the first thing we gotta look at is that for this, the main solution being is that, yes, there should be a limit put into place. With high school sports and just sports in general are supposed to be there to help a student in their learning and education, and it should not take precedent over it, with them both having many equals and should be taken care of. Now, for this, the first thing to look at is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who went into this and stated that school sports in general have many benefits for a student. However, they should not be the sole focus of their life and should instead be used to help it out. The first thing to then look at is the cultural and social lens. With socially, there's many benefits to be gained. The first being is that socially, through high school sports, it can decrease depression, increase physical health, and it can also build time management and self-esteem within students, being able to be part of a larger group and community and helping them be connected with others. Stating of how it can also allow students from any background and environment to come together when before they may not have had these chances. With this graph further showing many different benefits as well, from physical, psychological, and social, ranging from teamwork to academic preferences to even lowering people's blood pressures. The next major thing would be a quote then from Nelson Mandela, who goes further into the effects sports can have on people socially, believing that they can help connect not only countries and nations, but also individuals, with their overall having the ability to change and shape the world and create hope where once there wasn't. Now, culturally, sports have had a huge part in American culture and society. Whereas other nations may not as much, America is different, with many families and communities becoming enwrapped in their high school or college sports, wanting their children to then follow in their place within these sports, having this deep connection. This, while good in many regards, can have the negatives, with a student then believing they are forced to attend these sports when before they may not want to and feel pressured into achieving stuff in them in order to make their family members proud. This going then into many of the negative social effects, as we can see, the overinvestment into sports can then lead to failures of depression and failure if they're not able to achieve, forcing a student to try and push too much pressure into their work that can often leave them stressed or even have panic attacks. This can then further the divides in it. Another thing is that while team sports can keep kids away from drugs, it can also prove to be a gateway into them, from things like peer pressure. With this one report from Duke High School Sports Field Unhealthy Behaviors, it is stated that of the 60% of boys surveyed in this exam, it's stated that many of them, while didn't have decreased levels of drug use and stuff like that, they had increased amounts of fighting and alcohol abuse, showing that peer pressure and other things can then lead to further things and abuses that they would not have originally done. Now, this then goes into a further quote by Theodore, who further states that while he's delighted to have his son play football, believing in its manly and rough sports can help a student grow, which in many cases is true, he doesn't want it to become the sole focus of his child's life, believing his education to be far more important. Believing in Theodore's own regard that even when he joined the military, he wasn't the strongest, but he helped lead his soldiers in other ways. Now, this further then goes into the scientific lens. As we can see, scientifically, it is believed that sports in general can have a huge influence on people. In that, sports, as you can tell, can have a huge physical activity increase in students through their times in high school, leading to a better immune system and stronger muscles. The stated activity can then also decrease unnecessary fats and increase a student's immune system, helping them fight off later diseases thanks to their increased physical activity. Though, however, these benefits have to still be counterbalanced without letting the sport overtake their education, with them both being important in a student's development, with not wanting one to overtake the other. Now, further than risks into this is that the body itself can be severely damaged in sports, with some injuries can prove fatal or life-threatening received, and while other ones may simply be sprains or strains on the muscles in the short run, in the long run this can lead to effects in the bodies like arthritis, with then severe injuries can cause mental and physical debuffs and hinder it. This can also then lead to long-term effects like dementia from too many concussions. As we see on the image here, head injuries are quite common, especially in football, hockey, and also wrestling. And in many of these students, some of these injuries done in high school or college can then affect them in their later years. The report here shows that many of the different places where an injury can occur, with the largest being the head, the fingers, and the ankles. And while for the fingers and ankles, those can often not prove as fatal, for the head being in such large numbers, it is quite bad and terrifying in some regards, seeing as that's where most of the mental growth will occur, and enough damage can then severely limit this. Now, another thing to look then into is the economic cost that high school sports can have, with them generally having a huge cost financially on a family. Overall, school sports, however, had a huge increase in cost over the years. Within the past 15 years alone, there's been a reported 500% increase. In 2003, costs for a single sport were about $50, simple enough. But then in 2018, it was reported that a single sport would now cost about $250, a major increase. And overall, when before only 1 in 8 students couldn't participate in a sport due to its cost, that has now grown to 1 in 5. And another thing then is that even if you're able to then afford all these costs, if you have a severe enough injury, these can have then further costs upon a family having to treat the injury. With the injury could prove dangerous enough where they can never then participate in the sport again, with any hopes for a high education from the sports thanks to a scholarship out the window. And going into scholarships, while many people would expect a full ride scholarship from sports, those are often quite rare. And while smaller scholarships are frequently given, larger ones like a full ride are often rare. So, in conclusion, school sports have many advantages for many students to participate in and enjoy. However, they should still be aware of the potential disadvantages that can cause and be aware of any costs that can result. A balance should be maintained between education and sport for the future benefit of the student.
Okay. Large, huge round of applause. All right, a couple of questions. How did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
Well, I would say overall, because originally at first when I was looking into the stuff, I originally began thinking just what effects do sports have in people in general, and many of the pros and cons to this. Over time, and then moved more towards the effect it has on students through their growth in high school and college, believing that that's a much more crucial time for intellectual development than later on in years. So it would be proved to be a much more delicate time where you want to balance in your life.
Okay, thank you. What additional questions emerged from your research, and why are they important?
I would say some additional questions. One major one would just be how much sports have sort of taken over many schools' curriculums over many other fields, whereas at much of the time they take up much of the school's financial costs, where other fields are beginning to lack, and why this is, and if they should be changed, believing that education will be far more important.
Okay, thank you. Another round of applause, huge round of applause.